Indian Creek Caverns Incident. On the 27th of March, 1977, 4 young men entered Indian Creek Caverns in Missouri. Doug Beckerderfer and Gary Blades were 20, Ed Brown was 20, and Wayne Smith was 18. They left a note on their truck with a phone number before entering. The cave was a wild system that locals called Old Mud Cave. What they didn't know was that torrential rain had started falling above them. Indian Creek Caverns floods when it rains heavily. The 4 young men were inexperienced and didn't know the danger. By Sunday evening, they should have been heading back, but they failed to return. Ed Brown's father called authorities. The cave was flooding badly. 7 inches of rain had fallen, draining underground into the caverns. By Monday afternoon, experienced cave rescuers were called in. At 8 a.m. Tuesday morning, rescuers went in. Water level was 5 feet above normal. Rescuers waded through chest-deep water with only inches of airspace. At 9 a.m., just 390 feet from the entrance, they found them. The 4 young men were lying in 2.5 feet of water. They were arranged in a strange, ordered line. Each man had his hands clutched on the person in front at chest level. A human chain, locked together even in death. The lead man held glasses in one hand and a flashlight in the other. Around his neck, the electric headlamp was still glowing after 36 hours. Rescuers pieced together what happened. The 4 had entered Sunday morning when everything was fine. While they explored, the water rose and blocked the entrance. They retreated to dry upper levels to wait. Hours passed and hypothermia set in from the cold and wet conditions. Monday morning, they decided to try escaping as a human chain. The lead man put in a fresh battery. Each person held the one in front so no one got separated. They reached the entrance, but water was still too deep. They turned back, but the lead man collapsed from hypothermia. When he fell, the others fell too. They went down in the water, still holding each other. Their lungs filled with water. Even at the end, they refused to let go. The coroner determined drowning was the cause, but hypothermia had shut down their bodies first. The strange way they were found suggested they died at almost the same moment. Cat's Cave Incident. On the 29th of December, 1980, 7 kids were looking for adventure during Christmas break. They gathered at a sandstone cliff near Ben Lomond in California. It was a gray, damp winter day after weeks of steady rain. The cliff rose about 200 feet. Near the top was Cat's Cave, a shallow rock shelter about 3 feet deep. Local kids had climbed up for years to carve their names in the soft sandstone. At 4 p.m., 2 boys decided to climb up. Sean Carson was 14 and Steve McGovern was 12. They reached the shallow shelter 200 feet up. Sean had brought a claw hammer. He planned to carve his name into the cave ceiling like kids before him. He raised the hammer and started pounding on the sandstone overhead. Steve watched and took a turn too. At approximately 4:15 p.m., there was a rumble. The cave ceiling let go. About 2 feet of sandstone fell. Sean Carson was buried completely under tons of rock. Steve McGovern was buried up to his chest but could breathe. He started screaming. The 5 kids at the base heard Steve's terrified voice. 3 climbed up immediately while 2 ran to call for help. The Ben Lomond Fire Department arrived in 10 minutes. 5 minutes later, both boys were freed. Steve was uninjured, not a scratch on him. Sean was under 2 feet of debris with no pulse. He wasn't breathing. An ambulance rushed him to the hospital with medics performing CPR, but doctors declared the 14-year-old boy dead. Diccan Pot Incident. On the 19th of January 2025, experienced cave explorers met in North Yorkshire. They planned to explore Diccan Pot, a well-known cave system near Settle. The cave's first pitch was a vertical drop of 100 feet. The cave's design included a traverse that blocked the view from above. Once a caver started descending, they disappeared from sight. It was a cold winter day. The group performed safety checks before going down. They checked equipment, ropes, and harnesses carefully. At 12:27 p.m., the group took positions around the first pitch. The caver going down did final equipment checks. The rope stretched tight over the edge into darkness. Team members above watched the rope for signs of progress. Minutes passed as the caver descended. Without warning, a loud bang suddenly broke the quiet. Team members immediately knew something was wrong. They tried to communicate but were met with silence. They tested the rope system. The rope had become taut, suggesting their teammate might be suspended and injured. They couldn't see what had happened. The group called the Cave Rescue Organization for help. The rescue team arrived with specialized equipment. They set up rope systems at the cave entrance. The rescue team leader rappelled down the 100-foot pitch. When he reached the bottom, his worst fears were confirmed. The caver lay motionless on the rocky floor. The rescuer checked for pulse and breathing, but found none. More team members rappelled down. They carefully placed the explorer onto a rescue stretcher. Lifting the stretcher 100 feet straight up took hours of careful work. Finally, they brought the caver to the surface. Paramedics were waiting but could only confirm he was gone. Dante's Descent Cave Incident. Dante's Descent sits in the high desert near Ash Fork, Arizona, about 50 miles west of Flagstaff. This is a remote, dangerous natural pit that drops 300 feet straight down into the earth. The formation gets its ominous name from Dante's Inferno because it looks like a gateway to hell. On September 23rd, 1986, 33-year-old Eugene Campbell had been drawn to this remote desert pit. A few days before September 23rd, 2 experienced cave explorers encountered Campbell at the pit. They found him sitting alone at the edge with his legs hanging over, drinking drinking beer. He appeared very despondent and deeply troubled to the experienced spelunkers. The two explorers were concerned enough to approach him and assess his state of mind. Campbell eventually left the area that day, but the spelunkers remained worried. His friends also became worried about him after that incident. They were specifically concerned that he might be contemplating harming himself. Campbell had apparently been exhibiting behavior that made people who cared about him worried. On the night of September 23rd, shortly after midnight, Campbell returned to Dante's descent. This time he convinced a friend to come with him to the remote location. The two men arrived in the darkness with flashlights as their only light source. Dante's descent is intimidating during the day but terrifying at night. A flashlight beam can't penetrate 300 feet of darkness in the massive void. Campbell and his friend approached the edge of the pit in the darkness, but something went horribly wrong at the edge of the pit that night. According to the witness account, Campbell suddenly fell into the pit. One moment he was standing at the edge, the next moment he was gone. He plummeted 300 feet down into the darkness of Dante's descent. His friend watched in absolute horror as Campbell disappeared into the black void below. The sound of someone falling 300 feet would have been terrifying to hear. Campbell's friend was suddenly alone at the edge, knowing his companion had fallen. There was no way to climb down or reach Campbell in the darkness. The psychological trauma of witnessing this would have been overwhelming for the friend. The friend somehow managed to get help in his state of shock. When emergency responders arrived, they confirmed no one could survive a 300-foot fall. The recovery of Campbell's body was an extremely dangerous and complex operation. Professional rescue teams rappelled down 300 feet using specialized equipment. The vertical walls required ropes anchored into solid rock for safety. At the bottom, working in darkness, they secured Campbell's body into a stretcher. A coordinated pulley system was used to lift the stretcher inch by inch. But questions remain about what really happened that night at the pit. Did Campbell slip accidentally while trying to get a better look? Was he under the influence of alcohol as suggested by his earlier drinking? Did his previous despondent behavior mean this wasn't an accident at all? Campbell's friend would be the only person who could answer these questions, but the trauma might have affected his ability to provide clear details. The fact that Campbell had been seen in a despondent state days earlier raises questions. Combined with his friend's concerns, it's possible this wasn't purely accidental. Alternatively, Campbell might have genuinely slipped on uneven ground in the darkness. Eugene Campbell's death remains a tragedy regardless of what truly happened. A 33-year-old man lost his life falling 300 feet into a dark desert pit. His friend was left with traumatic memories that would haunt him forever. Driebelbis Cave Incident. On Saturday evening, October 1st, 1983, 6 experienced cave explorers entered Driebelbis Cave near Kutztown, Pennsylvania. These were seasoned spelunkers who knew the underground world intimately. For hours, they navigated underground passages, making their way deeper into the earth. Around 2 a.m., the group decided to head back to the surface. Robert E. Scott, 36 years old, was bringing up the rear of the group. Scott found himself about 75 feet from the cave entrance in a vertical crevice. The passage was a narrow slot stretching 80 feet high and generally 12 inches wide, but the crevice narrowed to only 7 to 8 inches in its middle section. As Scott maneuvered through this tight section, his hand slipped on wet rock. Without warning, his body dropped down into the narrowest part of the crevice. Scott found himself wedged tightly on his left side between rock walls. Every surface was rounded and slick with mud, with nothing to grab onto. Scott's companions quickly discovered his predicament when they lost contact with him. No matter what they tried, they couldn't get Scott free from the crevice. After 8 grueling hours of failed attempts, they left to get outside help. At 9:30 a.m. per Sunday morning, volunteers from 4 fire departments arrived. The complexity became apparent as Scott was wedged deep underground. Authorities contacted the National Cave Rescue Commission for specialized help. By Sunday afternoon, 14 highly trained cave rescue specialists flew in from Pittsburgh. When the team first contacted Scott, he was in good spirits and alert. But as Sunday wore on, Scott's demeanor began to change dramatically. The psychological pressure of being trapped began taking its toll. Scott became increasingly irrational and abusive toward his rescuers. The rescue team learned that Scott was epileptic, adding medical complexity. Twice during the rescue, he was given medication to prevent seizures. Rescuers strung a high line above Scott and placed slings around his body. Every time they made progress, Scott would begin thrashing wildly. His violent movements defeated any progress and worsened his situation. The rescue team established monitoring equipment to track his vital signs. Keeping him warm became critical as cave temperatures can cause hypothermia. They used heat packs, high-intensity lights, and hair dryers for warmth. Despite being trapped, Scott was able to eat and drink throughout the ordeal, but Scott's erratic behavior became the biggest obstacle to his rescue. He screamed abuse at the very people risking their lives to save him. The medical team recognized that sedation might be key to successful rescue. However, doctors refused to authorize the use of tranquilizers or sedatives. Technical rescue efforts continued with inflatable airbags, grease, and plastic sheeting. The crevice seemed designed to prevent exactly what they were trying to accomplish. As Monday morning approached, Scott had been trapped for over 24 24 hours. Around 7 a.m. Monday, as Scott delivered another tantrum, disaster struck. His vital signs suddenly ceased and the monitoring equipment went flat. Scott lost consciousness after his body succumbed to incredible stress. The rescue team immediately began emergency medical procedures. After 29 hours underground, Robert Scott's body had reached its limits. With Scott unconscious, they used painful extraction methods to drag him upward. At 12:25 p.m. Monday, Scott was finally freed after over 30 hours trapped. But shortly after extraction, Robert E. Scott was pronounced dead. Talucah Cave Incident. On June 29, 2005, students and instructors gathered at Talucah Cave in Alabama for a training exercise. They were part of the National Cave Rescue Commission's summer seminar. Their mission was to practice rescuing an injured person from a 35-foot vertical drop. The group descended into Talucah Cave through the main entrance. After 20 minutes through twisting passages, they reached a larger chamber. Finally, they reached the skylight room with a vertical pit. This would be their training ground to practice hauling an injured person up. Tim Lawn, 41 years old, volunteered to serve as the pretend patient. His background in rope systems made him perfect for the role. The next hour was spent carefully preparing the rope system. Students assembled complex rigging using climbing ropes under instructor supervision. They installed anchors in solid rock and tested every connection. 2 students were designated as edge attendants to guide the rope. Every piece of equipment was inspected twice for safety. Lawn put on his harness, connected his device, and clipped into the line. Lawn began his descent over the lip of the pit as planned. The lowering operation proceeded with textbook precision. Every few feet, Lawn called out his status to those above. The team reconfigured their rope system to haul Lawn back up. The hauling command echoed and the team began pulling together. One edge attendant called out that Lawn was 15 feet up from the bottom. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. Then disaster struck without any warning. A sharp crack echoed through the chamber like a gunshot. Several chunks of limestone broke free from the lip above. The rocks began their deadly plunge toward Lawn suspended below. Lawn raised his left arm to protect his head instinctively. The first limestone chunk struck his forearm with sickening impact. The force spun him like a pendulum in the narrow pit. A second bigger rock struck him squarely in the lower back. The force drove the air from his lungs audibly. The chamber erupted into panic as training became real rescue. The team immediately reversed the rope system to lower Lawn down. They could hear Lawn groaning in pain from the impacts below. A weak response confirmed he was conscious but badly hurt. When Lawn reached the bottom, instructors prepared for medical assessment. The assessment revealed severe bruising to his arm and lower back trauma. They decided to evacuate Lawn through a horizontal entrance 300 yards away. This avoided the dangerous vertical pit with loose rock threatening above. After 45 minutes, they emerged to waiting paramedics outside. An ambulance transported Lawn to the nearest emergency hospital.